95 tons of American steel, and it still couldn't see its own aim. In March of 1910, one of these machines tore 70,000 cubic yards of rock and clay out of a Panamanian mountainside in 25 days flat, a record nobody on that continent had come close to touching. Its bucket alone swallowed 8 tons in a single bite. It ran on coal, water, and a 4-man crew who trusted their lives to a boiler bolted onto railroad wheels. And over 9 years of digging, machines like it would average more than 1 million cubic yards apiece. That's not excavation. That's a mountain range losing a fight it didn't know it was in. It didn't look like a machine that could kill an industry. It looked like a machine built to save one. Picture it the way the men who worked it saw it. Black smoke standing straight up in dead tropical air. A boom swinging around on its own axis like it was hunting for something. Steel teeth biting into a hillside that had already buried 20,000 Frenchmen who tried this before and failed. Hot enough to blister a man's hands through his gloves. Loud enough that crews went half-deaf inside a year. For 9 years, this machine did exactly what it was built to do. It won. It finished the job years ahead of schedule and under budget, and it buried more than 5,000 more men doing it. And somewhere underneath all that digging, without anyone in Washington or Wall Street quite noticing it happen, this machine also started killing something else, something older, richer, and a lot more powerful than a swamp full of mosquitoes. Nobody in 1913 thought the shovel tearing through that mountain was a threat to a railroad boardroom 2,000 miles north. Why would they? What does a ditch in a Panamanian jungle have to do with freight rates in Chicago? What could a steam shovel possibly take away from a business empire that hadn't lost a fight in 50 years? This was the good guy's machine. American steel finishing American ambition. On schedule. In a jungle that had already eaten one empire's money and a French engineer's reputation whole. But finish that canal, and a door opens. And standing on the other side of that door is a question that every transcontinental railroad executive in the country had spent 50 years hoping nobody would ever get to ask out loud. What happens to a monopoly the day a machine hands its own competition a shortcut across an entire continent? That's the question this machine answered. It would take 60 years, 2 world wars, and the slow death of some of the biggest names in American railroading for the country to find out just how completely. Nobody handed this machine that job on purpose. Nobody in South Milwaukee, Wisconsin, where these shovels rolled off the line, ever drew up blueprints for an industry killer. That's not how this story works, and it's not how it needs to work to be true. Sometimes the weapon and the tool are the exact same object, and the only difference between them is which side of the transaction you happen to be standing on. This is a story about a machine that worked exactly as intended, finished its job better than anyone dared hope, and still managed to leave a scar on the country that built it, a scar that wouldn't fully show itself for another 60 years. Keep that shovel in your head. 95 tons. Black smoke standing straight up in dead air, a boom that never stops moving. Everything that follows happened underneath it. Chapter 1. The machine that dug a grave it never meant to dig. Start with the body count, because the body count is where this machine earns its keep. More than 5,600 men died getting this machine its worksite. Not soldiers, laborers, drillers, cranemen, track gangs. Most of them West Indian contract workers who came for a wage and left, if they left at all, in a box stamped by the Isthmian Canal Commission. That's before the machine has moved a single yard of dirt. Once it started, the ground itself turned against it. Sections of mountainside didn't just erode, they moved, whole and alive, at a crawling pace that outlasted entire work shifts, swallowing steam shovels, railroad track, and the men standing on both, sometimes with no warning at all, beyond a crack in the earth nobody thought to read as a sentence. In a single detonation, gone unexploded and left buried in the fill, 23 men died in one afternoon when a shovel's bucket found what the drilling crews had missed. Malaria alone would go on to fill more than 100,000 hospital admissions before the project was through. At one point, canal doctors were handing out 40,000 doses of quinine a day just to keep the workforce upright. Meanwhile, the machines kept moving faster than anyone had planned for. At the busiest hours of the dig, a fully loaded train pulled out of that mountain roughly once every 60 seconds, around the clock, hauling away rock and mud that a fleet of 95-ton monsters had torn loose, faster than the railroad underneath them could quite keep up with. And the man Washington put in charge of the deadliest stretch of that ground, the officer who gave it 16-hour days for 5 straight years, never lived to see his own machine finish the job. He was in an army coffin before the water ever reached the cut he'd spent his health digging. The dynamite alone should have been its own headline. 27,000 metric tons of it detonated across 9 years, enough to level a city if it had ever gone off in one place at one time instead of 600 separate charges a day, on schedule, like clockwork, in a canyon barely wide enough to hold the machines waiting to clean up after each blast. This machine finished its work roughly 2 years ahead of its original schedule, the part that genuinely doesn't add up. It came in tens of millions of dollars under budget. By every measure the men who built it cared about, it was a total, unqualified triumph, the kind of story America still tells itself today. So how does a total, unqualified triumph end up gutting one of America's own industries? How does a machine built entirely to serve American commerce turn around, less than a year after it finishes, and start quietly bleeding out a business empire that had ruled this country's freight for half a century? That's the debt this whole story owes you. We're paying it, just not yet. Chapter 2. The Mountain That Killed the French First. Before there was a machine, there was a graveyard with an unfinished ditch running through the middle of it. Ferdinand de Lesseps, the Frenchman who'd conquered the Suez Desert a decade earlier, arrived in Panama in 1881, utterly certain that a jungle isthmus would bow to the same methods that had cracked open Egypt. He was wrong, in ways that would take his company 8 years and roughly 20,000 lives to fully understand. At first, this had nothing to do with engineering skill at all. The real obstacle was an insect nobody in 1881 had yet learned to fear. Yellow fever and malaria didn't announce themselves as antagonists. They arrived as bad air, bad luck, the tropics doing what everyone assumed the tropics did to white men and laborers alike. De Lesseps's company burned through nearly $300 million chasing a sea-level canal design that ignored the terrain entirely. And by 1889, bankrupt and buried, they walked away from a half-dug scar across the Continental Divide. The United States bought that scar in 1904, and for its first year, it looked like America was about to repeat every French mistake at a faster pace. Yellow fever and malaria killed hundreds of workers within months. The first chief engineer, a man named John Findlay Wallace, grew so certain he'd die on the isthmus that he shipped a metal coffin ahead of himself, just in case he needed it in a hurry. By the middle of 1905, 3 out of every 4 American workers who'd arrived with him had already fled home, and Wallace himself followed not long after, his coffin still empty, occupied instead by the body of one of his own men. This was the moment the entire American canal effort could have died the same death the French one had. A workforce in open revolt against an invisible enemy, a chief engineer packing for a funeral that hadn't happened yet, and a mountain nobody had even started seriously cutting into. No amount of extra horsepower was going to solve this one. A single doctor did. Colonel William Crawford Gorge had already broken yellow fever's back once, in Havana, by draining, oiling, and screening off every drop of standing water a mosquito could breed in. Roosevelt gave him the same authority in Panama, and by 1906, Gorge had done something the French never managed in 8 years of trying. He'd made the isthmus survivable. Malaria never fully left. Records over the full construction period would still show close to 1,000 deaths from it alone. But the plague that had buried an empire's ambition was, for the first time, under control. Gorge's crews drained swamps, poured kerosene over standing water by the barrel, screened hospital wards, and fumigated whole neighborhoods of Panama City and Colón street by street. It was slow, unglamorous public health work, with no dynamite and no headlines, and it did more to make this canal possible than any machine that would eventually dig it. Without Gorge, there is no shovel story at all. There's just a second graveyard, where the first one had been. Only once that fight was won could the second fight begin, the one against the mountain itself. 9 miles of the canal's 50-mile route ran straight through the spine of the Continental Divide, a stretch the engineers called the Culebra Cut, and it needed to be lowered by more than 150 feet across its entire width. Pick and shovel labor had done maybe a tenth of that work under the French. At the rate American hand labor could manage, engineers privately estimated the cut alone would take decades more. Command of that exact 9-mile stretch fell in 1908 to an Army engineer named David Dubose-Gaillard, the same officer this story already told you would never live to see his own machine finish the job. Remember that name. He's the one who paid for this chapter of the story with everything he had left, and we're not done with him yet. This is the enemy the machine was actually built to fight, a mountain that had already beaten one empire, standing in the way of a canal a sitting American president had staked his legacy on. Pick and shovel labor, the kind that had done most of the digging under the French, moves earth in cubic yards per man per day. A 95-ton steam shovel, in that same stretch of time, moves earth in thousands. This mountain had been quietly relying on the slowness of human effort to keep men losing to it for decades. A single steam shovel erased that entire advantage in one stroke. By November of 1906, President Roosevelt himself came down to see the machines at work, climbing up onto the operator's platform of a Bucyrus shovel in a white linen suit, while photographers scrambled for position below him. It was theater, and everyone involved knew it was theater. But it was theater built on top of a genuinely new fact about what American industry could now do to a landscape that had, until very recently, been considered unconquerable. Back home, newspapers ran the photographs of a sitting president at the controls of a machine tearing apart a mountain that had already swallowed one empire's fortune. And the public reaction was exactly what you'd expect: awe, mixed with a certain relief that America, unlike France, seemed to actually know what it was doing down there. Nobody reading those newspapers in 1906 had any reason to imagine that the same photograph would look different, decades later, to a railroad executive watching his own company's freight volumes quietly decline. Roosevelt himself had no patience for the political hand-wringing back home about whether any of this was even legal. "I took the canal zone and let Congress debate," he said of the whole venture. And while Washington argued procedure, 77 of the largest excavating machines American industry had ever built were already being loaded onto ships bound for the Isthmus. 95 tons each, 5 cubic yard buckets, built by the Bucyrus Foundry and Manufacturing Company of South Milwaukee, Wisconsin, a firm that had spent decades perfecting steam shovels for American railroad grading before anyone in Panama ever needed one. The mountain didn't know it yet, but its opponent had just arrived by boat. Chapter 3. 8 tons at a bite. None of this works if the machine itself can't survive what the mountain throws back at it. Strip away the jungle and the history, and here is what sat at the bottom of Culebra Cut, taking that punishment head-on. 95 tons of steel on railroad trucks, a boiler stoked by 2 firemen shoveling coal into a firebox that never got a rest, and a boom-mounted bucket on a rigid dipper stick that a craneman drove forward into the rock face, with steam-powered pistons doing the pushing. 4 men ran the whole machine, 2 more laid track ahead of it. A support crew of 6 kept both moving. 95 tons doesn't mean much as a number on its own, so put it next to something you already know the size of. That's roughly the weight of 60 full-grown elephants, standing on a footprint smaller than a two-car garage, and every part of that weight was in motion for 10 hours a day. Swinging, crowding, biting, dumping. None of it standing still long enough to rust. The whole apparatus ran on a single, brutally simple chain reaction. Coal burns in the firebox. The heat turns water into steam. Steam under pressure drives the pistons that crowd the dipper stick forward into rock and clay. The dipper fills, the boom swings the loaded bucket clear on its own axis, and 8 tons of spoil drops into a waiting railcar below. Then the whole cycle starts again, sometimes in under a minute, for 10 hours straight, 6 days a week. That's the easy part to explain. What should have made it impossible is everything that came next. Every ounce of rock and mud these machines tore loose had to go somewhere, and somewhere meant 19 miles of freshly laid railroad track hauling it away, around the clock, on a schedule so tight that at the busiest hours a loaded train left the cut roughly every 60 seconds. 160 train loads a day, moving material out from a gash barely 9 miles long. Miss a beat in that rhythm, and the shovels themselves had nowhere left to dump. But could a machine built for grading flat railroad yards even survive this kind of punishment? The men who built the Bucyrus shovels for American railroads never designed them for tropical rock that shattered unpredictably, or clay that turned to grease in a single afternoon downpour. So the drilling crews went ahead of the shovels with compressed air equipment, boring holes for dynamite. 30 miles of air pipe eventually threaded through the cut to power them, and twice a day, every day, work stopped entirely while hundreds of charges went off in a single coordinated blast. Fire 600 charges a day, on that kind of schedule, and the odds say one of them eventually misfires, sits quiet, gets buried under the next round of spoil, and never goes off at all. Nobody could account for every single one. That single unglamorous fact, a charge that goes missing instead of detonating, is the exact debt this story owes you from its opening minute, and it comes due later, in full, when a shovel's bucket finds one of those missing charges the hard way. And every single blast reshaped the exact terrain the shovels had to conquer next. The International Board of Consulting Engineers had assured everyone the slopes would hold stable at a height of roughly 240 feet. In practice, some began sliding at barely 60. That gap between the engineers' math and the mountain's actual behavior is the whole story of Culebra Cut in miniature. On paper, this was a straightforward excavation problem. Remove enough material at a wide enough angle and the walls stay put. No amount of engineering confidence changes what a slope actually does once you've cut the support out from under it, especially when the layer doing the supporting turns out to be nothing sturdier than wet clay. Somewhere in the middle of all this, 2 shovels earned names that would follow them through the rest of the project: Shovel 222 and Shovel 230, digging from opposite ends of the same stretch of cut, closing the gap between them one bite at a time, year after year, with no way of knowing which one of them would reach the middle first. Bucyrus wasn't alone in this fight either. Of the 102 steam shovels working the canal, 77 wore the Bucyrus name, but 24 came from the Marion Steam Shovel Company of Ohio, and 1 lone unit came from Thew. Crews on both machines knew exactly whose iron they were running, and a Bucyrus crew and a Marion crew working adjacent sections did not need much encouragement to turn a workday into a contest. It's 2 in the morning on the cut, and you're standing on a shovel's rear deck with a fireman half your size and twice your strength, feeding coal into a firebox that's already glowing orange through its seams. The boom above you groans with every swing. Somewhere off in the dark, a whistle means someone found where the last blast left a charge that never went off. You don't look up from the fire, you just shovel faster, because the machine doesn't stop for men who stop. By 1910, The shovel crews had turned all of this into something close to sport, racing each other to see who could move the most material in a shift. That competitive streak is exactly what put one crew's name into the record books that March, 70,000 cubic yards in 25 days, a number that stood as the benchmark for the rest of the project. The mountain was losing. Everyone could see it. What nobody could see yet was what winning would eventually cost the people who'd built the machine doing the winning. Chapter 4. Hell's Gorge never slept. 6,000 men worked inside Culebra Cut at any given time, and the men who'd been there longest had a name for it that stuck in every newspaper account back home. Hell's Gorge. Not a nickname born of exaggeration, a cauldron of noise, with locomotives roaring past every 60 seconds, and steam shovels belching smoke into air already thick enough to chew, where drowning and electrocution were just two more ordinary ways a shift could end early, dynamite notwithstanding. The maintenance nightmares alone would have broken a lesser operation. 95 tons of moving steel, run flat out for 10 hours a day in tropical humidity that rotted rope and rusted fittings within weeks, meant something on every machine was always failing. Boilers scaled up with mineral deposits from local water. Dipper teeth wore down against rock that never behaved the same way twice. And every single repair happened in the open, in the heat, with the next blast already scheduled, whether the shovel was ready or not. There was no such thing as a routine shift down in that cut. A crane man might spend a morning threading his bucket through a narrow gap between two rail cars without so much as scraping the paint, then spend the afternoon watching his own machine's tracks sink slowly into ground that had turned to soup overnight. Firemen fed coal into boilers that occasionally cracked under pressure without warning, sending scalding steam across a deck with nowhere to run. None of it made the newspapers back home. All of it was simply Tuesday. The men who ran these machines weren't unskilled labor thrown at a problem. A craneman's job demanded the same precision as running a locomotive, threading 8 tons of swinging steel past a rail car without crushing the men loading it, and doing it in rock dust so thick some days you couldn't see the far wall of the cut. Skill kept you alive here. Luck kept you alive here too. And luck ran out on a schedule nobody could predict. There were quieter hours, even here. Sunday mornings, the drilling crews stood down, and the valley went almost silent. Just birds and dripping condensation off cooling boilers, and the far-off sound of a work train idling somewhere out of sight. Men wrote letters home on those mornings, or slept, or walked down to watch the water rise in sections of canal already finished elsewhere along the route, sections where none of this violence was happening anymore. It never lasted. By Monday, the whistle blew again, and Hell's Gorge went back to being exactly what its name promised. Which is worth remembering, because the central mystery of this whole story doesn't come from the danger. It comes from what the danger eventually paid for, a shortcut that would go on to matter thousands of miles from here, in places these men had never heard of and would never see finished. At the center of Hell's Gorge stood the one man whose job was to make an unstable mountain hold still long enough to dig it. Gaillard had been running this stretch since 1908 by now, and the job had settled into a punishing rhythm. 16 hours a day, 5 days a week that felt like 7, while the ground beneath his own crews kept trying to kill them. He came to describe the slides he watched swallow his own work in a phrase that stuck. Tropical glaciers, he called them, mud instead of ice, but every bit as patient and every bit as capable of erasing months of labor in a single night. The work never let up long enough for him to rest. 15,000 tourists came through in 1911 to watch the machines dig, treating a graveyard-turned construction site as a spectacle. Gaillard kept working through the crowds, through the wet season slides and the dry season slides that geologists still didn't fully understand, through a steam shovel operators' strike in 1907 that halted the cut entirely until wages were settled. Every delay meant the schedule tightened somewhere else. Every tightened schedule meant longer days for a man who was already giving the job everything he had left. The men underneath Gaillard called it grim, unglamorous, unending work, the kind that never produced a headline unless something went wrong. But something was always about to go wrong, somewhere along 9 miles of unstable ground, and the man in charge of keeping ahead of it was running on a body that had nothing left to give. Chapter 5. The Cut That Ate Its Own Engineer. October 4th, 1907. Days of heavy rain had already soaked the slopes above the stretch called Cucaracha, when the first crack appeared in the hillside, barely noticed at the time. Within hours, that crack became a wound. 400,000 cubic meters of clay and rock began moving downhill, not as a single collapse, but as a slow, relentless glacier of mud, advancing at roughly 14 feet a day for 10 straight days. 2 steam shovels working the base of the slope had no warning worth the name. The ground beneath them simply stopped being solid. Both machines were overturned and half buried where they stood, track and compressed air piping torn apart. The drainage system that was supposed to keep water moving through the cut wrecked, along with everything else. Crews cleared what they could, and within days the hill had slid right back into the gap they'd just cleared, undoing a week of labor in an afternoon. The clay was too soft for a shovel bucket to even grip. Engineers had to sluice it out with pressurized water instead, washing the mountain away in liquid form because there was no other way left to move it. That was the first slide the Americans faced. It would not be the last, and it would not be the deadliest. Slides like it kept coming, year after year, in patterns nobody could fully predict. Some crept during the wet season, when rain soaked the clay layers into something closer to grease. Others broke loose in the dry season instead, when nobody expected them at all, when the rock itself simply gave up holding its own weight. By January of 1912, a fresh slide at that same stretch of Cucaracha blocked the canal completely all over again, burying months of finished work under a new wall of earth that hadn't existed the week before. Gaillard, at the end of a very long rope, wired his superior asking what to do next. Chief Engineer Goethals answered in 5 blunt words: "Hell, dig it out again." So they dug it out again, and again after that, because nobody in charge of this project had any other answer to give. In December of 1908, a shovel crew working a section of the cut struck something the drilling teams had missed entirely: a dynamite charge from an earlier blast that had never detonated, still buried live in the fill. The bucket found it before any man did. 23 men working that section died in the explosion that followed, gone in the time it took a steel tooth to close on packed earth. The blast tore apart rail cars and equipment alongside the men working near them, scattering wreckage across ground that had, minutes earlier, looked no different from any other stretch of the cut. There was no ceremony for it. There rarely was. The whistle blew, the wounded and the dead were carried out, and within a day or two the shovels were back at work on the same stretch of ground, because a 9-mile mountain doesn't stop for grief, and neither could the men paid to dig through it. Every crew working near a section that had already been blasted once now had to wonder, quietly, whether the ground beneath their own machine was hiding a charge nobody had accounted for. Gaillard kept working through all of it. The slides, the strike, the deaths, the tourists watching from a safe distance, as though this were a show staged for their benefit, rather than a war being fought in slow motion. By early 1913, the cut was closing. Shovels 222 and 230, digging toward each other from opposite ends of the same stretch for the better part of a decade, finally met at the base of the divide on May the 20th. There was no dynamite involved in that final moment, no dramatic collapse, just 2 sets of steel teeth, closing the last few feet of distance between them, one bucket at a time, until there was simply no more mountain left standing in between. Steel met steel, where a mountain had stood since long before either machine or country existed. The path was clear. Gaillard didn't get to enjoy it for long. Promoted to colonel that autumn in recognition of what he'd built, he collapsed from exhaustion barely a month later and was shipped home to Johns Hopkins Hospital in Baltimore. What doctors found and treated as a brain tumor took him on December the 5th, 1913. 8 months before the canal he'd spent 5 years of 16-hour days digging would officially open to the world. He never saw a ship pass through it. The canal would go on to make history without him. In his honor, the stretch of ground that had nearly killed him a dozen times over was renamed the Gorge Cut 2 years later. A small mercy for a man who'd given the project everything a body has to give and had nothing left over to spend on watching it succeed. The machine had won its fight against the mountain. The cost of that win, in dead workers, buried equipment, and one exhausted engineer's own body, was already paid in full before a single ship ever used the shortcut he'd died building. Chapter 6. The Grave. The Shovel Dug. August the 15th, 1914. The steamship Ancon made the first official crossing, Atlantic to Pacific, in roughly 10 hours, gliding through a mountain that had taken French and American crews 32 years combined to open, and cost the two nations combined a body count north of 25,000 men to finish. The ceremony planned for that day was supposed to be enormous. It barely made the back pages of any newspaper in the country, because 3 weeks earlier, the opening shots of the First World War had gone off in Europe, and nobody in 1914 had room left in a headline for a canal, let alone for counting the dead who'd built it. That timing turned out to be the least of the ironies waiting inside this story. 2 years before that quiet opening, Congress had already quietly loaded a weapon and pointed it at the biggest railroad companies in the country, without most of them fully grasping what they'd signed off on. For half a century, the transcontinental railroads had kept freight rates high across the country by a simple, brutal method: buy up any water-based competitor before it could undercut you. The old Pacific Mail Steamship Company, once an independent rival on coastal and Isthmian routes, had been swallowed into railroad ownership decades earlier and quietly strangled from the inside, its ships left half empty, and its rates kept high enough not to threaten its new masters. That single acquisition, and others like it, had let the transcontinental lines set the price of crossing the continent almost however they pleased, for 2 generations running. It worked exactly as intended, for exactly as long as nobody could build a cheaper way around it. A canal changed that math permanently, and everybody in a railroad boardroom in 1912 knew it. The Panama Canal Act of 1912 made that strategy illegal, effective the 1st of July 1914. Any railroad that owned, controlled, or held any interest in a water carrier competing for the same freight now had to divest it entirely, or lose access to the canal outright. Congress had, in effect, disarmed the railroad's oldest defense against water competition 6 weeks before the water competition itself opened for business. The machine had built the door. Congress had quietly kicked away the bar the railroads used to hold it shut. What came through that door was cheap. Shipping freight from New York to San Francisco by sea, around Cape Horn, had always been slower than rail, but never dramatically more expensive. The ocean route took too long to matter for most cargo. Cut 8,000 miles off that voyage by running straight through Panama instead, and the math flipped entirely. Water freight could now beat the transcontinental railroads on price, and for freight that wasn't racing a clock, do it while barely losing any time at all. Contemporary economists watched the numbers shift almost immediately. Writing in the closing weeks of 1913, before the canal had even formally opened, one naval commercial analyst was already predicting that at least some transcontinental rail shipments would move at cheaper rates than they ever could have, without the water route now waiting to compete for them. By the end of the following year, academic economists were publishing entire papers, doing nothing but tracking exactly how far transcontinental rates had already fallen since the water route opened for business. So go back to the question this whole story owes you. How does a machine built to serve American commerce end up wounding one of American industry's own cornerstones? The mechanism. In full, it dug the door open, Congress disarmed the lock, and cheap water freight walked straight through both. The railroads didn't collapse overnight. Nothing this large ever does. What they got instead was a wound that never fully closed. A decades-long rate war against water competition they could no longer legally buy their way out of, compounding, year after year, against every other pressure the 20th century was about to throw at them. Some railroads felt it faster than others, and one felt it before the canal had even opened, because its own leadership had walked into the wound with their eyes open. Back in 1901, the Milwaukee Roads Board had first debated building its own line all the way to the Pacific Northwest, rather than staying dependent on rivals for that traffic. They sent an engineer west that same year to price out duplicating a competitor's route. His estimate came back at $45 million. And right there in the boardroom debate, on the record, sat an argument against building it at all. A canal across Panama was already being discussed in Washington, and a canal would gut the very long-haul freight traffic the new line was supposed to capture. The board weighed that warning against the promise of booming Pacific Northwest growth, and in November of 1905, they authorized construction anyway. Ground broke in 1906. By the time the Pacific Extension reached Seattle and Tacoma in 1909, the final bill had climbed to $234 million, more than 5 times that original engineer's estimate, for a route that even its own directors had once flagged as vulnerable to the exact machine that was, at that very moment, still tearing through Culebra Cut, a continent away. Railroad historians looking back at that decision have not been kind to it. In retrospect, the line should have never been built, one later account concluded. And the opening of the Panama Canal, 5 years after that line was finished, did nothing to help an already struggling investment find its footing. The extension never found the profitability its backers had promised. Desperate to cut its own operating costs against water rates it couldn't match, the Milwaukee Road eventually electrified hundreds of miles of that same mountain route through Montana, Idaho, and Washington, betting an enormous sum on lower fuel costs, instead of ever solving the traffic problem underneath it. It bled money for decades regardless, propped up by the rest of the network, until the whole company finally filed for bankruptcy in 1977. 3 years later, the Pacific Extension itself was abandoned outright, torn up in places, sold off in others. A 68-year-old bet against a canal that had already been open for most of its working life. The Milwaukee Road wasn't destroyed by a steam shovel in Panama alone, and it's worth being honest about that before going any further. Decades of overbuilt regional trackage, rigid federal rate regulation that made it nearly impossible to cut losses or merge efficiently, and a national shift toward trucks and interstate highways all did far more damage than any single competitor ever could on its own. The Rock Island Railroad, which filed its own bankruptcy in 1975 and was fully liquidated by 1980, went down for almost none of these same reasons: an overbuilt Midwest grain network, brutal regulation, and a dying agricultural traffic base, with barely a trace of Panama Canal competition anywhere in its file. Both roads collapsed in the same decade, both got caught by the same regulatory system, and Congress finally loosened that system with the Staggers Act in 1980, 5 years too late to save either one. But the Milwaukee Road's Pacific Extension is a different case, and the record on it is specific. It was conceived with the canal's shadow already visible on the horizon, built anyway, and it never recovered the ground the water route took from it before the first train even ran the full line. It was one blade in a slower collapse, not the whole weapon. A wound opened early, in 1914, that a 50-year-old railroad empire spent the rest of the century trying, and largely failing, to close. So this is where the machine's story actually ends, and it isn't where anyone digging that mountain in 1913 would have guessed. The steam shovel that tore through Culebra Cut is remembered today almost entirely as a triumph. American ambition made physical, moving mountains ahead of schedule and under budget, the kind of story this country still likes to tell about itself. Ask anyone what the Panama Canal represents, and you'll get some version of the same answer. Proof that American engineering could outbuild nature itself. The industry that Shortcut helped wound gets remembered as something else entirely. A casualty of progress, ground down by trucks and highways and federal regulation until nobody thinks to ask what opened the very first crack, decades before any of that. Both memories are true. Neither one is the whole picture, and the machine that started all of it never got to see how the story ended either way. It just kept digging until the job in front of it was finished, the same way it was built to. As for the shovels themselves, the actual 95-ton machines that dug that mountain apart, bucket by 8-ton bucket, for 9 straight years, the record on what became of them afterward runs thin and then goes quiet. Sold off once the job was finished, scattered to mining outfits and railroad grading crews across Alaska, Spain, Costa Rica, Ohio. Not one of them stayed in Panama. No monument marks where 222 and 230 finally closed the gap between them. And no plaque anywhere credits a steam shovel with anything that happened to American railroads 60 years later. The men who ran them went home, or didn't, and the machines themselves went wherever the next mountain needed moving, doing exactly the same job somewhere else, with nobody watching for what it might cost this time. What didn't disappear was the company that built them. Bucyrus merged with the Erie Steam Shovel Company in 1927, and the machines that carried the combined name went on to dig the open-pit mines and strip the coal seams that powered American industry for the rest of the century. The same lineage, the same steel bones, scaled up from 95 tons into machines large enough to be known by name instead of number. That name would outlive the century itself, bought out by Caterpillar in 2010 for the better part of $8 billion. A single continuous thread running from a mountain in Panama straight through to the mines and mills this channel has already walked through once before. The mountain lost first. The railroads lost slower, quieter, and for reasons the shovel itself never fully owned alone. But somewhere underneath both stories sits the same 9 miles of Panamanian rock, and the same machine that proved, once and for all, exactly how completely American engineering could win a fight it never even knew it had picked.